Let's start from the top. Yay! Hey everybody, this is MTG Nexus, kind of discussing how I approach deck building. Fortunately, Sweet Liberties did explain to me that I was not recording the original time, or I was recording but not microphoning because computer updates. I got quite a bit of ways through the discussion here, so just going to kind of strip away all the stuff that I've done so far and kind of start back from the beginning. So, approaching deck building with a particular meta in mind, I pulled up the data on the most recent week or so from MTG Goldfish. And once again, this isn't the greatest example of decks that are doing well. If you flip the days, like obviously different decks kind of shift around a little bit. If you go 30 days out, everything's kind of shuffling around down here. You go 90 days out, Rakdos doesn't even exist. One of the crazy things is Europile just continues to like dominate. I'm curious what 365 days looks like. 365 days is Jund and Burn over the last year. But we're really only interested in the last 7 days worth of results. The big things to note, I really don't look below like 10 here. The thing is, like, if you go too far down the rabbit hole, you're getting into like decks that are just like 1% of the meta, 2% of the meta, all that kind of stuff. It's really, if you're trying to meta game, that's going too deep, especially in a field like Modern. Thanks for the follow, did you just? But I do once again apologize that I was not talking while doing things. So, even though I was speaking, no words were coming out. Tonight's just going to be just the deck building. The league will be a different night, Secret Air. If I wanted to get to any type of World of Warcraft tonight, it just would take too long to do that. So I'm just kind of going through the deck building tonight, and we'll probably run it through a league tomorrow night. Just from a time perspective, because I do work tomorrow, unfortunately. But the main thing here, when you're approaching deck building, is you gotta keep in mind what decks you're trying to attack. So we basically have the Europile control decks. We have the Rakdos Prowess Death Shadow, Humans, Azorius Control, Stoneblade, Izzet Blitz, Titan and Reclaimer Titan, basically Niv to Light, which I actually haven't seen much, and then Spirits, which I'm curious how this is having results when I'm not seeing it in leagues. And then if we really wanted to meta, like Tron, Mono Red, Jund, Heliod combo, a lot of these kind of fall into the same things, like Europile and Azorius. While they do have a little bit different ways to attack them, they're basically control decks, counter spells, removal spells. They just differ in how they close out the game. Rakdos, Death Shadow, Humans, and Blitz and Stoneblade all are relatively creature-based decks that we can interact with on the creature basis. Titan and Amulet Titan, obviously, they're basically combo decks that have some control and some creature elements to it. They're trying to get to a point where they're even making a bunch of Field of the Dead tokens, Valakiting you, or they're just valuing them with your lands and such, gaining some life. Niv to Light, obviously this is a mid-range deck with a bunch of spells and then some, Nivs and such to close out the game. Spirits is obviously a tempo-based creature deck, with some amount of counter magic, either in the form of this one's not, but the new counter spell from M21, and then obviously they have Unsettled Mariner to play around as well as Spell Queller. Plus they have their own creature synergies. So these are just the kind of things that we're looking at as we're building the deck. The one thing to consider with the approach here is, what decks are you trying to beat? Like, what decks are your primary focus? So Europiles and Death Shadow would definitely be things. And then Humans and Stoneblade are the ones I'm going to focus on. Azorius, not so much. Like, Azorius, don't get me wrong, is a deck to be respected. But it's a deck that I historically think Burn has a pretty good matchup against. And a lot of the same things you're going to be playing against Azorius, you're going to be bringing in against Europile. Oops All Spells, I don't really think is worth trying to meta against. There's not too much Burn can do against Oops in particular, other than have some amount of graveyard hate and hope that they don't sideboard into the Belcher plan for some reason. And then Amulet and Titan Vial or Reclaimer, Titan, whatever you want to call this one. Very similar strategies that, yeah, you can put some thought into, but generally they're pretty rough matchups for Burn. And then, obviously, Jund, Burn, the Mirror Match, all that stuff. We'll kind of touch on briefly, but the main decks you're gearing towards are Europile, Rakdos, and then Stoneblade, as well as humans. I did some talking to M. Hayashi about some stuff today, so that's going to play a role in the cards that I would consider building in the deck, but this is just cards that I would play as a starting point to try to beat that deck, or if I had to play this event tomorrow, and didn't have time to test, more exotic cards. So this is what I would consider the core of Boros. The 12 creatures, the Boros Charms, the Lightning Bolts, and the Lava Spikes. Those are the cards that, from build to build, are generally going to be in every build of Boros. You're going to see 2 to 3 mountains, 2 or 3 sacred foundries, the 4 canopy lands, and then some 6 to 7 fetch lands, and the 4 inspiring vantage. That's generally what you're going to see out of straight Boros. No splash, no destructive revelries, just the red and the white cards. The 20th land slot, if you decide to play 20 lands, which I normally do, usually is either an additional fetch land or a fiery islet, just to have a canopy land. I generally lean towards islet. We might want to consider, the consideration with that is generally, can you afford to take another point or 2 of damage in most matchups if you draw the fiery islet, or if you're on like a fiery islet, Sunbay Canyon land, do you account for that in your deck building because you're facing a lot of aggressive decks? While I look at this format, Rakdos Death Shadow, while it does have some aggressive elements, is a mid-range aggressive deck, so you generally aren't terribly worried about racing against that deck. That's more of a they kill you in large chunks, especially when they're on the Death Shadow or Scourge plan. Like, you can usually deal with Monastery Swift Spear or Soulscar Mage quite easily. So you're generally going to get chunked more than nickeled and dimed. Humans also tends to steamroll us in large chunks, so while it is a racing situation and points can matter, Stoneblade also is a deck that can nickel and dime us, but generally when they're winning with their by a landslide, and we have to draw to our final burn. And then the Blitz, once again, also a deck that doesn't tend to nickel and dime us, tends to hit you in huge chunks, can burn us out sometimes. So looking at that, either way, I would probably still learn towards the fiery islet, just simply because I don't like losing to flood, and I also like running 20 lands because I don't like losing to being stuck on one land and not being able to cast my spells. So, any questions so far in chat, or are you guys following this fairly well? So that's kind of my beginning building philosophy. I always want some number of Path to Exile on the sideboard, regardless of how I'm approaching whatever matchups. I know 2 is usually the minimum that I'm willing to run. Roiling Vortex, I was talking about at the beginning, because some number of Roiling Vortex you're likely going to want in addition to Skull Cracks, because Piles are just such a pain in the butt. And against any type of mid-range deck, you're going to generally want Roiling Vortex. I think its stock has dropped rather considerably with the uptick of humans and Death Shadow, as well as the uptick in Death and Taxes. So, concentrating first on Piles, their main win condition obviously is Omnath, and Field of the Dead. And then they obviously have some amount of spot removal, some amount of counter spells, and then they're boarding in things like Timely Reinforcements, Ether Gust, potentially Celestial Purges. So you got to account for basically life gain and spot removal. Well, I'm going to get into that. this is the core. Oh, as far as was it part of the core? Yes, most likely. And I still think it is, but it's one of the spells that I think is it could be part of the core, but the numbers on it vary. Like I consider these ones the core because the numbers on them generally don't vary. You generally have Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt, Boros Charm. These are all generally 4-ofs. The only card in this of the core spells that ever gotten monkeyed with really is Eidolon sometimes. Like sometimes people would shave on Eidolons or sideboard it in some metas. But the rest of these almost always see play as 4-ofs. Like the other cards, like I may as well just pull them up because we're probably gonna have some number of them in each thing, and this is the kind of actually if you go back and watch the original stream, there were some number of Rift Bolts, some number of Blaze, some number of Helix, obviously Lightning Helix, not War Leader's Helix, and then obviously Skewers, the newcomer to the party. And then you have Skull Cracks. Like these cards all kind of vary in terms of like if they're in the deck, how many are in the deck. Like these particular ones were the core, and then these ones have kind of varied on, based on the meta, how many you're playing of each. Like Searing Blaze. Like, how many Searing Blaze do you want to play against something like Uro and Omnath? Probably not more than 2, but when you're staring at a meta full of, prowess creatures, humans, and death and taxes, you probably at least want a third one, right? Maybe even 4 if you're willing to weaken your original matchup against Uropile. If I narrow it down a little bit. But say you're willing to run 3 of those, how many Skull Cracks do you want against Uropile? Probably 4. How many do you want against humans? Especially in the post-Break War games. Probably 4, because it gives you a way to deal with Auriok Champion. How many do you want to run in the Burn Mirror match? Especially if they're on Lightning Helix and Core Firewalker. Probably 4. What other decks? Rakdos, Death Shadow. They play some amount of Cling to Dusts and some amount of Collective Brutalities, depending on the build. You probably want 2 or 3 or 4. So you're looking at that. Looking at humans, obviously we already talked on that. Azorius Control, you definitely want access to the 4 Skull Cracks. Stoneblade, you definitely want access to 4 Skull Cracks. Niv to Light, you definitely want access to 4 Skull Cracks. Oops, all spells, weird deck, not going to cover it. Amulet and Elvish Reclaimer Titan has access to Radiant Fountain. You definitely want access to Skull Cracks. They also have cards on the sideboard that gain them life. So, minimum you're looking at, you probably want 4 Skull Cracks in your 75. Beyond that, you're looking at Riftbolt. Riftbolt obviously very mana efficient, and if you're playing a Incinerator strategy, you want access to it. Lightning Helix. Lightning Helix is probably the weakest of the white-based spells, simply because it's just on rate with your other 2 damage spells, and it is a little bit more difficult to cast. It's not like Boros Charm that gives you the extra point of damage. The main time you want Lightning Helix is when you're facing down a ton of racing situations. And looking at the top 10 decks, Uropile, you're generally not in a racing situation. Death Shadow, somewhat. Humans, yes. Azorius Control, not so much. Stoneblade, yes. Blitz, yes. Niv to Light, sometimes. Amulet and Reclaimer Amulet, not so much. Or Reclaimer Titan, not so much. Spirits, yes. Jun sometimes. So I wouldn't play too high a priority on Helix. I'd probably go 2 or 3 with those. And then, so we're looking at, we have three more slots if we want to run the 4 Skull Cracks to kind of counteract Titan. So I'd probably add a 3rd Lightning Helix, or yeah, 3rd Lightning Helix. And then, that leaves us with 2 copies of either Riftbolt or Skewer the Critics. The only thing to consider with Riftbolt in particular is you want to be able to board out all copies of Riftbolt against any deck in which you're boarding in Roiling Vortex. So against Uro Piles, Blue-White Control, Niv to Light, and I think those are the only ones you'd be bringing in Roiling Vortex for sure. You want to be able to board out all of your Riftbolts, so I think a 2-for-2 split is fine there. So I think you might want to go up with the 4 copies of Skewer. Once again, it's all kind of subjective how you want to approach your deck building, but that's kind of how I would approach building the main deck, is like, what decks am I trying to be? And if I want as few dead cards as possible in our main deck, 3 Searing Blaze seems like a fine number. You're generally going to see 1 a game, and even against Uro Piles, you're going to have targets. So I think that's kind of like where you would start with the main deck. And this is the main deck that I'd be willing to roll into a this kind of event if I was playing on like a challenge tomorrow or something. What cards am I interested in? Once you kind of get the core deck you want, then you can start building your sideboard to be a unit with your main deck 60. So if you're looking at Uro Pile specifically and wanted to cut cards, what cards are not particularly good against Uro Pile? Riftbolt, especially if they have Teferi Time Raveler, is a card you're not particularly interested. Some amount of them do play that. Plus, we're interested in bringing in Roiling Vortex if we have some in our sideboard. So that's one card to consider cutting. Searing Blaze is usually pretty bad against Uro Piles. So these cards you definitely want to be able to board out against Uro Pile. And Lightning Helix is probably the next worst card, or at least some number of them. Could also shave some or skewer the critics, as it can be awkward at times. So you at least have 6 slots you want to be able to board out. So if we're on a Roiling Vortex plan in those matchups, we probably at least want access to a second one. Another card you could consider playing would be Flames the Blood Hand, but that's a lot less effective at 3 mana. Even for 4 damage can be a little bit weird. In spots like that, I used to like Exquisite Firecraft, but because of the presence of Ether Gust, I really don't like the card. The encounter ability isn't as good as it used to be. So we definitely want to bring these in, and then you might want some number of Path to Exile. I generally don't like to fight Uro on that angle, but Omnath might require Path, but then you're feeding into the Field of the Dead plan. So I really just like relying on anti-life gain and then some amount of graveyard disruption. Now, some of the graveyard disruption people like against them are the Soul Guide Lantern, Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, Surgical Extraction is one I know Poseidon and some of the people on the Burn Discord have been working with. The problem I have with Surgical in particular is the fact that if you're playing Roiling Vortex, it's a huge non-bow. And because of the, whenever a player casts a spell, if they pay no mana, it deals 5 damage to that player. So I'm more interested in either Relic or Soul Guide Lantern. So I think because I'm at least going to bring in or add 2 Relics to the sideboard, with the consideration that I might bring in 2 Paths to cut these cards, and I might just add 2 more Relics. If I were just focusing on the matchup, I'd add 2 more Relics. But I'm not going to add all the cards until we take a look more at the meta to see what we want to bring in. So I don't really like bringing in Path in this matchup, but I would if I had to. if I don't have like more relics or whatever else to bring in. And there really isn't too much else I'd want to bring in the matchup. You know, thinking of other cards you'll see in Burn's sideboard traditionally. You know, you have Core Firewalker, you have Rest in Peace. I don't really like bringing in Rest in Peace against what they're doing. You might see either Disenchant or Wear Tear. You know, you might also see Smash to Smithereens. Trying to think of different cards you're going to see in a Burn sideboard at this point in time. Deflecting Palm could be a card you could bring in a pinch, but at that point the Uro deck has already gained 6 life from Uro, so I don't think this is a particular card that you want to bring in that matchup. And then, so like these are the other cards you would see in a Burn sideboard at the moment. Other cards you used to see is like Exquisite Firecraft. You've seen Stony Silence. Some other form of Graveyard Hate, obviously. I think that covers most of the hate cards you'll see in a Burn sideboard outside of, you know, additional copies of Skullcrack, additional copies of Searing Blaze, you know, that kind of stuff. More copies of Path to Exile. I think that covers most of the cards you generally see in a Burn sideboard. So these are the cards that are definitely in our sideboard at the moment. And then moving on from the Uro pile, the next deck we're looking at is Rakdos Death Shadow, which the cards you're going to want to board out in that matchup are a little bit weird. Because of the nature of their deck, most of our main deck is actually pretty good against them. One of the cards that you board out in most creature-based matchups is Boros Charm, because it doesn't interact with creatures in any way, shape, or form, and while the 4 damage is amazing, you're more concerned with dealing with their early Soul Scar Mage, Monastery Swift Spear, or Bowmat Courier, depending on the build, and then trying to close out the game before their Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclaves can come online. So at minimum, you want to be able to cut the 4 copies of Boros Charm. Another card that I typically like to cut some in those matchups, especially on the draw, is Eidolon. So this is kind of a play-draw dependent cut. And then like the rest of your deck, you know, is pretty reasonable against them. You might even shave like a copy of Searing Blaze because it's only good against their prowess creatures and or Bowmat Courier things. It's actually pretty terrible against their big dumb idiots. And I don't have enough reps against their deck to know. So I'm going to actually board under the assumption that I want to board out Boros Charms and Searing Blazes. So let's say we add 2 copies of Deflecting Palm. So we have 4 cards we would currently want to bring in. We really don't want to bring in Relic against a Prowess deck for the most part because they're not really doing a whole lot with their graveyard. I mean, sure, they have Luris, and we could conceivably bring in Relic. What else are they using the graveyard for? They have some number of Lava Darts, but I'm not going to bring in Graveyard Hate for that. You could easily see a sideboard package of like these 6, but I would think I probably want at least another copy of Path to Exile. So I'm going to least up to a 3rd copy of Path here. So 3 Paths, 2 Relics, 2 Deflecting Palms for these 7. Seems like a pretty good swap out. So this is our sideboard here so far, disregarding these cards so far. We could bring in Core Firewalker because a lot of their removal is red, but depending on how their deck is built, they could have both Collective Brutality and Fatal Push, making Core Firewalker significantly worse. So I'm not really willing to board that in against that matchup specifically until I have more testing data. So that is 9 cards in our sideboard so far, just having looked at 2 matchups. Another matchup to look at is Humans. Humans, obviously, we're not going to be bringing in Relics. Cards you want to board out against Humans. Minimum, you want to board out your 4 copies of Eidolon of the Great Revel. Against Ether Vial decks, you almost always board out Eidolon. And then other cards you would consider cutting next are the Boros Charms. Cards that you're interested in against the humans decks, more Blaze effects, Path to Exiles, Deflecting Palms. You can bring in cards like Smash to Smithereens and Wear Tear. I wouldn't suggest it unless you see something like weird out of their decks. But generally, you at least want to cut these 4 and potentially some number of the charms. So for that reason, I'd probably go up to the 4th Path, because it is a card that we're willing to bring in against Death Shadow as well. So these 6, you can bring in against humans and still leave in 2 Boros Charms just to have the reach. Alternatively, you could add the 4th Searing Blaze to the sideboard, but I don't think that's particularly ideal in the cards that we're staring off against. Stoneblade's a little bit weird. They have the Ether Vial, they have the creatures, the creatures and equipment, including some of them adding Maul of the Skyclaves. So, creature gets +2/+2 flying in first strike, which is kind of dumb, very powerful. And one of the cards, and I'm not going to include it in this particular build, but I was talking to Hayashi how he approaches attacking the Stoneblade or the Death and Taxes matchup, and he likes to bring in all of his artifact removal and Ratchet Bomb, because Ratchet Bomb, while it is a little bit slow, does deal with their Ether Vials, potentially does deal with like their protection from white guy or protection from red guys, whether it be Firewalker, Burrington Forge Tender, Oriok Champion, whatever one they happen to be running. And it deals with Ether Vial, which is like their huge advantage in the matchup. And while I don't like bringing in Smash to Smithereen effects or that kind of stuff because they're sometimes dead cards against that matchup, I could see bringing in some number of Smash to Smithereens. Deflecting Palm I like a good bit less in that matchup because most of their creatures don't deal a bunch of damage. So I could easily see a setup where we either bring in some number of Smashes or some number of Wear Tears. As far as which one we want, a lot of that depends on the rest of the sideboard. It's kind of where Burn gets a little bit tricky, is like, trying to allocate the right amount of resources. Once again, our sideboard is these 10 cards so far. We haven't added any Smash effects or anything. I think for now, against the Death and Taxes, let's say we want to again look at the same 8 cards that we do against humans. You definitely want the 4 Path. You might want like 2 copies of Disenchant or Smash effects. So let's just say 1 Smash, 1 Wear Tear for right now. Say you want to bring in this package, once again, board in like Eidolons in the Boros Charms. So that leaves you with like this kind of as your sideboard so far. Once again, going back to the main setup. And then the other matchup I said we were going to concentrate on was Blitz. Blitz and Opsal spells we can take a look at. Blitz, obviously, Eidolon you generally want to leave in against Blitz. Skullcrack I actually like to board out quite a bit. Skullcrack or Boros Charm. Boros Charm, once again, against a non-creature deck. Skullcrack isn't particularly effective at fighting Dragon's Claw. The cards you obviously want in that matchup, you definitely want the 4 copies of Path to Exile. Deflecting Palm can be a reasonable card in that matchup. And then any number of core Firewalkers you usually bring in. So say I at least want to add a second core Firewalker to the sideboard for that matchup in particular, as well as running into the Burn Mirror. Never hurts to have extra cards. Say we board out the Rest in Peace for now. So you're starting to look like you have more and more like a comprehensive kind of sideboard thing here, with 1 more flex slot really, but you want to bring in the Firewalkers, Deflecting Palms in the pass. You can board out the Boros Charms and the Skullcracks. Once again, they have some amount of life gain in Dragon's Claw, but Skullcrack is not particularly good at preventing that, and you really don't want to be running Roiling Vortex against an aggressive base deck. So that's kind of where you're at with like the sideboarding there, is you might board out these cards. Once again, the general rule is you board out your blazes against non-creature decks, or decks that don't have a whole lot of creatures. You board out your Eidolons against things that either don't care about it, like most versions of Tron and Eldrazi Tron. It's not the most effective card. Like, it has some spots where it's okay, but generally it's not particularly good. And against Aether Vial decks, you board out Eidolon. And then Boros Charms tend to come out against decks that are more creature-based when you gotta leave in your Helixes and your... Yeah, I can cover that again here in a sec, Sleeping Wolf. I'm just finishing up this quick thought. But this is kind of where I'm at with the build that we're working on right now. That we'll probably be using tomorrow night. So my main thing against them, Sleeping Wolf, is I like Relic and Roiling Vortex out of the board against them. And then I like to have as much anti-life gain and such as I can cram in the main deck. So that's why we're featuring four Skull Cracks in this version. I still don't think it's a good matchup, but I've been really impressed with Relic and Roiling Vortex in those matchups in some of the different versions that I've played. I know Poseidon has been really high on Surgical Extraction, specifically against the Uro part of the deck. It is a bit of a nombo with Roiling Vortex. So those are the main cards. Like, I personally have liked Relic and Roiling Vortex. I know Poseidon has liked Surgical Extraction over Relic. I just like Relic because it has more utility against more matchups. And the main deck that you would want to target with hard graveyard hate is Dredge, and now Oops All Spells. But I don't think we're going to beat those matchups enough of the time, even with our hate anyway, because both decks have ways to sidestep the graveyard hate. So I'm more concerned with targeting decks that we actually have a pretty good chance against. And I like Relic and Roiling Vortex in those matchups. And then you generally board out like your Blaze effects first, and then, you know, Rift Bolts if you're bringing in Roiling Vortex. It's kind of how I would approach. That's kind of how I would approach the Uro matchup until I have more data on the matchup. As far as finishing up our build, so we basically have one more sideboard slot to add. I would consider probably adding the third Relic, especially if you know, we're considerably worried about the Uro piles. I would add Relic over this stuff. And, you know, ironically, I don't think we've arrived at a deck that's all that different from what Norath Decay played last weekend. I think I'd rather play Wear Tear over Smash at the moment, simply to have access to a Disenchant effect against the ley lines, which some decks are going to have. So I think this is where I would end up if I was preparing for a event tomorrow, and I was just like kind of like just theory crafting a deck. You know, as I was kind of going over like just the key matchups. You only want to, when you're trying to meta for a particular meta, you generally want to concentrate on like 3 or 4 matchups, especially with a deck like Burn, and like try to have cards that have overlapping effects. You know, like Path to Exile dealing with big dumb idiot creatures, Deflecting Palm, once again, big dumb idiot creatures. Relic of Progenitus, good against some of the mid-range value piles, while also giving you outs to decks like, you know, while also giving you outs to decks like Oops All Spells, their game plan if you can hold up the Relic activation. Roiling Vortex just being an anti-life gain thing. Core Firewalker, very narrow card, but very powerful in the matchups it's in. You know, and you can also even bring in Core Firewalker against the Shadow decks, the more aggressive-based ones, you know, if you don't see a ton of black removal out of them. So this kind of gives you, like, a pretty effective sideboard that's kind of geared towards Uro piles, Death Shadow, Death and Taxes, humans, without going too overboard on those matchups. no, even looking at what Norath had last weekend, like he's running Rest in Peace over Relic, perfectly respectable. He's running a third copy of Core Firewalker over the third copy of Path. He's a little bit different on the spells, like he has the fourth copy of Searing Blaze in the main deck. He actually had a fourth mountain over this Fiery Islet because of the way he'd set up his deck. But you know, we arrived at a deck that was very similar to what Norath arrived to last weekend, which doesn't surprise me because we're gearing towards a very similar meta. But once again, I like Relic over Rest in Peace in the current meta, although Rip is a little bit better against Oops All Spells on Relic, obviously. So I think that is where I would arrive at a deck that I would be building right now. Just as far as like hard targeting the specific meta, you know, that we were working against. And I did all that, and I didn't record this. I am doing great tonight. So, but yeah, this is kind of the deck that I would arrive at, most likely. You guys have any questions? And I'm probably going to have to turn around and redo all of this for YouTube again later. Yay. It's been a technologically challenging night. No. Well, I'm probably playing a league tomorrow night. I was just going through... I wanted to do something a little bit different on stream tonight as opposed to like doing, you know, more league play with somebody else's deck list or playing Death and Taxes to get reputations against a deck that I hate and seem to be losing to a lot lately. I just wanted to throw something different up on the YouTube channel, not the YouTube channel, the stream tonight, as opposed to just kind of the same old, same old. No, I'm not playing any events tomorrow. I work tomorrow, unfortunately. But, I don't think it's the best deck. I don't think it's the worst deck. I think the nice part about Burn right now is it's not being particularly targeted, because Death Shadow and Humans and Uropile are kind of the decks that are the kind of the decks to beat right now. I do think those decks are slightly better and are being targeted more, and I think that Blitz or Prowess is on the decline ever so slightly. So I think from the standpoint of being targeted, Burn's in a good spot, but from the standpoint of it has a lot of rough matchups. Uropile, we're probably a little bit of a dog too. Death Shadow matchups are always tricky. Humans and Death and Taxes are not particularly good matchups. In fact, I'd say that we're unfavored in both matchups. Blue-White Control can be favorable. And then everything else, we're probably slight dogs too. So overall, I would say, at least according to the top part of the meta, we're only favored against maybe Rakdos Death Shadow, Azorius Control, Is It Blitz, and maybe Spirits and Jund. Amulet and White in Reclaimer, it depends on how much they're respecting Burn. Oops All Spells, I don't know how consistent it is, so I can't really have a good gauge, but they are playing main deck Leyline, which is pretty bad for us. And then, I haven't seen much Niv to Light in the leagues, but Niv to Light is a pretty bad matchup. So overall, I would say Burn is not particularly well positioned right now, but it can obviously still win games. I would probably say it's maybe better position than Prowess at the moment, but still not a deck that I would be extremely confident that it's like the best time to play right now. But once again, what I would always say about the Modern format is Modern is more about the deck you know than necessarily the meta. I think metagaming is almost a fool's errand in Modern, and I think you're better off playing a deck you know. Now, if you know multiple different decks, like say you know Burn and Prowess, and say, I don't know, the Death Shadow deck, I'd probably play the Death Shadow deck right now. But say, you know, like Burn and Tron, I would say Burn's probably better positioned than Tron at the moment. Simply because Death Shadow can be a really rough matchup for Tron. But a lot of it is play the deck you know. You'll generally get more mileage out of it than trying to position or meta deck in Modern, and even to a certain extent in formats like Legacy. Like, the thing is, when you get into Eternal formats in particular, it's more about the knowledge you have of your deck, and, you know, because there's so many different viable decks in Modern. Like, yeah, Piles are the best deck in the format, and they're like 10% of the winner's metagame. But if you go into a room of, like, say, you know, say you're in like a PTQ or something in paper, say we're not in COVID times, and there's like 120 people there, you might see like 6 people on Pile and 4 people on Burn, and like 12 Jund players show up that day. You know, it's really hard to say, like, you can meta deck. Like, say you have a deck that's like, okay, Jund's a perfect example. Jund is a deck that you can meta game really well in a very narrow meta, but it's a deck that tends to get destroyed by, like, random nonsense that it cannot prepare for. You know, like, you can tune your Jund deck to beat, like, say, Death Shadow and Pile and, you know, whatever. Like, say, Jund could actually beat Pile. But then you run into a Burn deck and you're not playing that much life gain. You're playing a bunch of removal to deal with Death Shadow, and you run into a Burn deck. You're going to get destroyed. So you're just better off playing the deck you know. Like, if you have 2 or 3 decks, that's when you worry about meta decking. Like, say you have... That's why in a format like Modern, I usually like to keep at least 2 decks. Because generally, especially decks that are different than each other, because that gives you the option to play a different deck if things are worse. Like, I had Burn and Arclight Phoenix for quite a while. And, you know, a lot of the decks that Burn was good against, Arclight Phoenix was poor against. A lot of the decks that Arclight Phoenix was pretty good against, Burn was pretty poor against. You know, and now I have, in paper, I have both Burn and Tron. A lot of the same things. You know, like, Burn's pretty actively terrible against, you know, Soul Sisters and Bogles and, you know, Pile. Whereas Tron, for the most part, doesn't care what Soul Sisters is doing. For the most part, doesn't care what Bogles is doing if it finds an Ugin or an All Is Dust or an O-Stone. You know, and it can overpower the Piles. You know, so when you keep decks that are kind of like on dichotomies of each other, or like on opposite ends of the spectrum, you're generally, if you can master those 2 decks, in a pretty good position in most metas. So, hope that answers your question. That Sleeping Wolf Hearthstone, I'm presuming, or Sleeping Wolf High School, not really sure which. But I was going to do some WoW tonight, but I'm just kind of wiped out. Plus, I'm going to have to redo this video for tomorrow morning. So, since like the first 20 minutes are dead air here on Twitch until Sweet Liberties let me know. Sweet Liberties, thank you very much, by the way, if you're still in chat. But it's kind of where I landed on this concept. I'm going to redo this tomorrow morning for YouTube, but I'm going to wrap up the stream tonight. I want to thank everybody for tuning in for a little bit of an unorthodox stream, but and for technical issues because of computer updates. So, thanks everybody for tuning in. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Hope everybody has a great night.